Hello there. I'm Robert Grimm. Welcome to Technology Today. We're going to take a somewhat scenic route to the topic of today's talk. And the word that probably stuck out the most to you in the title sequence was the word apocalypse. The dictionary defines this to be the final destruction of the world, as described in the biblical book of Revelation. In all the action of this book, it is easy to overlook that the topic at hand, the main point of Revelation, is Judgment Day. And hence, there will be some judging in today's talk. But we're not being judged on a traffic ticket or crossing the street on a red light. No, we're being judged on our ethics. The dictionary defines ethics to be the moral principles that govern our lives, the moral correctness of our lives. But this talk is also about business, about the technology industry. And the term ethics tends to scare people away. So let's try something slightly softer, the social responsibility of business. That is taken straight from the title of an article in New York Times Magazine that appeared on September 13, 1970. A Friedman Doctrine. The social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. Well, so nominally, the article was written by Milton Friedman, but his wife Rose was a trained economist as well, ABD, and she collaborated with her husband on the underlying material. So let's acknowledge both Rose and Milton Friedman. So if you see the headline of this article, what is the social responsibility of business? Well, none, it seems. If you actually go through the effort and read the article, it's a little more, well, let's see. So, the responsibility of business is to make money while conforming to the rules of law and ethical custom. That sounds much better. And the Friedmans also allow that some businesses or organizations may just not care about money. So employers may have a different objective. Great. They could establish a corporation for an eleemosynary purpose. That's a word I haven't heard before. Well, it's really about being charitable. Think a hospital or a school. And then it may be about rendering a certain service. They also allow for long-run interests of a corporation. That may be to provide amenities to its community or to improving its government. I believe that this is somewhat a gold standard for the social or corporate responsibility. And I call this the Rosen Milton Friedman seal of good business keeping. There shouldn't be more, there shouldn't be less. And we'll get to what that implies. But the article probably wouldn't have had the impact it had if the Friedmans weren't also above a little trolling. So amongst all these very reasonable pronouncements, we find that markets are unanimous and that the political mechanism is about conformity, and then they start screaming socialism, and it's all about free markets, free enterprise, free society, freedom. And what is it really about? Yeah, freedom from social responsibility, or as I've been quipping for quite a while now, the freedom to be asocial. And what's the price of that? Well, $47 trillion, at least according to the Marxist-Leninists at the Rand Corporation. So before the early 1970s, the proceeds from the economy were shared amongst all income strata about equitably. That changed, and it changed because of this article in large part. And when you add it all up, the top percent earners in this country, the rich, they did a engaged in reverse socialism and redistributed $47 trillion into their own pockets from 1975 to 2018. If you want to understand why so many people are so angry, and we're seeing this playing out right now with the aftermath of the election, this is the number where everything has to start. Inequality is at frightening levels right now, and it's bound to get worse unless we change something. But that still is all a bit abstract, and it would be nice to apply our understanding of ethics, of social responsibility, corporate responsibility, on a more concrete example. And, well, the firm that comes to mind is Facebook, of course. Because as the mission statement says, their mission is to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. It helps that I worked for the firm for 9 months. I quit in July of 2019. I then spent about 2 months doing background research on which this talk is based. And I was writing an article about Facebook, but then I also needed some distance, and so I started again this summer. So the talk, in many ways, is a grim dossier on Facebook, or, well, it is the grim dossier on Facebook. And I'm going to answer 3 questions. First, why is Facebook so compelling? Second, why is it so dangerous? And third, what should we do about it?
1
واحد
1 1
واحد
1 1
واحد
1
Part 1, the Whore of Babylon, or nowadays, the Whore of Facebook. 2 aspects that combine to make Facebook amazingly compelling. In this section, I'm going to tell a short history of communications something. And I'm going to start out with communications technology. That goes back to my first day at Facebook, when Chief Product Officer Chris Cox gave a similar presentation. And on the horizontal, I'm plotting the years from 1800 to 2020. The choice of 1800 is somewhat arbitrary. I picked it because it's round, and also because the Industrial Revolution was well underway. The steam engine had already succeeded. And there really are 5 different communications modalities that are worth discussing. I am plotting the time it takes for a message to cross the Atlantic, because as a German living in the US, that's a time I really care about personally. And I'm also showing whether it's one-to-one messaging or one-to-many messaging. All right, so we have the letter. And till about the 1980s, 1990s, that was the most reliable way to communicate across the Atlantic. It took 12 days. The first technological innovation that really shortened this time was the telegram. It was invented in 1838, the single wire designed by Morse, and the first experimental line was built in 1843. But the first working undersea cable, I think it was the 5th attempt, only became operational in 1866. That cut it down from 12 days to 12 hours, so that was a great step forward. Only a few years later, the telephone was invented, and that cut down the time to communicate to instantaneous. However, originally, you needed quite some time to set up a phone call. You had to call the operator, the international operator, and they had to talk to their counter on the other side of the ocean. And so it could easily take 24 hours to set up. But even though the telephone was invented in the late 1870s, it took till 1927 for operator-assisted phone calls over the Atlantic to become a reality. This was via radio link. In September 1956, that switched to the first undersea cable. And in March 1963, it became direct dial. And then we're switching from the telecommunications to the inter-messaging. The internet was invented clearly earlier, but it became a mass medium starting in the 1990s. So there was chat, there was email. It could take 24 hours to deliver. I had a friend in Munich when I already lived in the States, and his internet service provider connected to the internet once a day. So every international email across the internet took 24 hours at least. And then video calls and rich messaging became a reality in the late 2000s. So those are the critical messages, communications technologies. And in a discussion amongst friends on Facebook, Jan LeCun, who also is the chief AI scientist for Facebook, but here he is clearly speaking for himself, we were talking about the negative effects of some communications technologies, and he pointed out that pretty much every single new technology led to a kind of moral panic. And I agree with him. This is well documented. This happened over and over again. Also, there were always attempts to imagine the next communication technology as an image of the previous one. And that view is very popular in the technology industry, to just focus on the technology. But I've learned one thing, one overriding lesson since I switched from academia to industry, and that is that technology and business reinforce each other. And to have great success with a technology, you usually also have to have great success with a business model. So I'm going to counter Jan's technology-only view with a second short history, the short history of communications business. And that's where it gets rather interesting, because Western Union is formed as the first modern monopoly. They really invented the modern monopoly. And that lasted till about after the war. But once the telephone took over internationally, Western Union was over as a telegram monopoly. AT&T, after the invention of the telephone, it got its patents in 1876, and they expired in 1893. So for a fairly short time, AT&T was a monopoly thanks to patents. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court to defend those. And then after the patents expired, for 20 years maybe, there was no monopoly, there was competition. The rate of growth of the telephone network in the US actually increased. And then AT&T very cleverly convinced the regulator, the federal government, that if it provided universal access so that everyone is guaranteed to get a phone, and it does all this investment in lines, it's also allowed to keep control. And that worked till 1984, when AT&T was split up. So next comes AOL. They bundled dial-up and content, so that's their fairly weak business innovation. And they also flooded the US with CD-ROMs, which was helpful at the time because if you wanted to go online, chances were you had an AOL CD-ROM at home. Next, over the last 13 years or so, Apple and Google unbundled the cell phone from the carriers, and then they erected their own wall, the app stores, which we know are rather ferocious. And then finally, Facebook excels at surveillance-based ad targeting. And so now if we take business and technology together, we get impact. And so I can tell the same story again for a third time. And this time I'm going to skip our timeline because it's fairly quick to tell the story of corporate technology impact. That means that Western Union made fast messaging possible. And that means suddenly there were entire interregional industries that became possible that weren't possible before. Pretty cool. AT&T made voice streaming possible. AOL made the internet accessible. Apple and Google made the internet portable. And finally, Facebook made the internet personal. And that really is the biggest impact of Facebook. This is why it is so appealing. It's a very personal internet. And that only is the US edition. So all these firms and all these technologies come from the United States. But if you lived in another country, you also experienced them. But you may have experienced them through the post office. That is the international edition of the slide. For Facebook, the person that really made this possible, who had the insight into the business and realized the business model, is Sheryl Sandberg. So she first helped Google to become profitable. Again, Google at the time wasn't even profitable. And grew the ad team from 5 to 5,000 employees, which is a pretty amazing achievement already. And then she outdid herself after becoming Facebook's COO and fully realized the potential of targeted advertising. I believe that in Silicon Valley, she still doesn't receive sufficient recognition. When people talk about Google or Facebook, they usually talk about the founders. But the person who really made these companies, put these companies on the map, is Sheryl Sandberg. That got her some unkind recognition in other quarters as well. Shoshana Zuboff called her the Typhoid Mary of surveillance capitalism.
R ist nah. R ist nah. R ist nah. 2.
Part 2, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, now Facebook. 4 aspects that make Facebook uniquely dangerous and impossible to reform. Horseman number 1 is emotional abuse. Let's play a little thought experiment for just 2 slides and to explore the impact of the business model. What if Facebook sold subscriptions? How would that look like? Well, for beginners, it would charge a flat monthly rate because that's easy to explain, easy to collect. Metered access is way too complicated, especially at this scale. So it would still encourage users to check in, maybe once a week or so, because we want engagement for the health of a social network. And finally, it probably would discourage users from lingering for too long because remember, it only charges a flat monthly rate because data centers ain't cheap, they require electricity. In reality, however, Facebook engages in surveillance capitalism. That means the longer people spend on platform, they share more about themselves, so that means there's more surveillance, but they also are exposed to more advertising, so it is a double plus. And the prime factor for getting people to spend time is emotional engagement. Facebook's feed is curated for just that. No matter what changes Facebook has made over the last 15 years, it has not messed with the core, the emotional engagement of this curated algorithm. Now, so peripheral things have changed, but that hasn't changed. And now the question becomes, how does this look like in practice? And I looked through press reports, and they usually have some fairly extreme example. So here is one from Bloomberg reported in March 2019. They report that in 2018, somebody in Sri Lanka posted something that started with, "Kill all Muslim babies without sparing a single one." I cut this down for length slightly without changing the meaning. And this post garnered 30 likes before the post was flagged by the person who talked to Bloomberg, presumably. And then after 6 days, it took that long, somebody had reviewed the post and said it was okay with the community standards. There was no real violation. So, yeah, that may be, but doesn't give us a good feel for our everyday interaction. Since we're still shortly after the US election, I took statistics from CrowdTangle, which is a firm that observes what is posted, what is popular on social networks. Unfortunately, CrowdTangle was bought by Facebook, so I don't have access to this service anymore. But Kay Roos, who is a journalist at the New York Times, tweets pretty much every day the top 10 daily posts on Facebook with outward-facing links. And I classified those links according to Republican-leaning, Democrat-leaning, neutral news, and other content. And as you can see here, for the month leading up to the US election, Facebook pretty much functioned as a right-wing propaganda network. It's all red. So there seems to be this bias against manifest reality on Facebook, because the algorithm already favors far-right anger, because anger is an emotion that engages. It also disfavors news in general. This is a change that was made in 2017 when Zuckerberg decided Facebook should focus more on the personal. This was publicly shared. What Facebook didn't share is that it also especially disfavors left-leaning news. And Mother Jones is the news media. They have recognized this in their statistics, and Facebook has repeatedly denied this bias to them in personal conversations. But as the Wall Street Journal reported on the 16th of October this year, Mark Zuckerberg personally approved of these changes. Okay, so this gives us some feel for anger being favored. But here's another take. So while I was at Facebook, I got ad credits, and I decided to boost Instagram posts of mine. I just wanted to experiment with images, how they resonate, and see what happens. I targeted anyone over 18 in the US or Europe with an interest depending on the picture, contemporary art, hipsters, and so on. And most of these posts reached between 11 and 17,000 people. They skewed towards the younger, equally to women and men, and they received maybe 1,800 to 3,300 likes. There were two posts that stuck out. The first one is the empty stage after the first part of Angels in America, which reached 46,300 people and saw 6,600 likes. And I'm not entirely sure why that was so popular, but it is a very popular play. The second post is the one I'm more interested in. It reached 33,000 people and 4,950 people engaged. So this is the image. This reflects more or less the view from the bedroom window of the room I lived in as a teenager. And I shot this picture 2 years ago at 4 a.m. in the morning. There was hardly any light. I really liked this picture because it reflects something of my personal history, of my teenage years, but it's not an easy picture. It's not a happy picture, a happy occasion. And here is the interesting part. For some reason, and I don't know why, this picture resonated deeply, and it was preferentially shown only to young women. You see this here. The demographics are heavily skewed to young women between 18 and 24. So I now have knowledge. I know that if I target women who are interested in contemporary art, and if I use depressing imagery, I may just have something that resonates. I'm not sure we should know this. And I can imagine that a very vicious feedback cycle here, which we don't know if it happens, because the algorithm selects for strong emotions. We humans, we learn what maximizes reach, as I just did, and each learns from the output of the other. But even if that's not the case, the arrangement that Facebook shows us only things or preferentially things that are emotionally engaging is abusive in the long term. Nothing can change that. Horseman number 2, the extreme scales. So again, back to the business of Facebook. If we rank Facebook as a global corporation, it is 6th by market capitalization, 10th by cash holdings, 18th by profit per employee, 20th by profit, and 390th by number of employees. This draws on this year's Fortune Global 500 ranking, the Global Cash 25 ranking from last year, and I believe one other source. Facebook's human reach is even more telling. So as of the last quarterly report, there were 56,653 employees. Yet Facebook had 1.82 billion daily active users, 2.74 billion monthly active users. But there are only 7.8 billion humans on Earth, which means 23% of humanity are daily users of Facebook, and 35% of humanity are monthly users of Facebook. Now, if we factor in that 1.4 billion Chinese are unreachable because behind the Great Firewall of China, then those percentages go even further up. Facebook reaches 28% of non-Chinese on a daily basis and 43% on a monthly basis. Yet there are only 57,000 employees. They're only in a few cities in the US and in Europe. So what's the worst that can happen? And we already know that because it has happened already. So, Facebook in Myanmar. The two of them are synonymous in the country because Facebook approached the cell phone carriers in the country several years ago, and it paid them so that the carriers made access to the Facebook app on cell phones free. At the time, Facebook had no business presence in Myanmar, and at the time, Facebook didn't have a single Burmese speaker as an employee. This has changed somewhat. Why? Well, Myanmar's military, which gave up control over the country 10 years ago, had been actively inflaming sectarian tensions. Their goal was that the population, when faced with unrest under civilian government, would want to return to military rule. They had a dedicated unit. Officers were trained in Moscow. Of course, Moscow always has to be involved when it comes to such activities. And then the worst case happened, the genocide amongst the Rohingya. The Rohingya have been a disfavored ethnic minority, Muslim minority in the country for quite a while. And there was an armed attack on the 25th of August, 2017. And in response, the genocide started. 24,000 Rohingya were murdered, 100,000 Rohingya displaced within the country. They continue to be displaced to this day, and 700,000 Rohingya fled, mostly to neighboring Bangladesh. The villages of the Rohingya continue to being razed to this day. And worse, Myanmar just held the second election since civilian rule, and the Rohingya couldn't even vote. So, how does this look like? Where do they live? What does this look like? Well, let's take a trip across half of the world. So this is my building in Brooklyn. This is where I'm recording this talk. And we're going to go all the way to the Gulf of Bengal. This is Kutupalong refugee camp. It is the largest refugee camp on Earth. It's housing about 600,000 humans. its density is about 46,000 people per square kilometer. By comparison, Manila in the Philippines is the densest human city at 41,515 people per square kilometer. The Bangladeshi government has disabled cell phones, has disabled the internet since September 2019 because they would really like to get rid of the Rohingya. The Rohingya cannot work. There is increasing evidence of drug and human trafficking. Violence is breaking out. There have been shootings at night. And Bangladesh wants to resettle them on an island that only emerged from the ocean in 2006. It's called Basan Char. And you see, they built all this infrastructure, but it's an island in an area that is prone to typhoons. There has been a super typhoon this summer, and its highest elevation is 2 meters above sea level. The terrible thing is that the extreme scales will ensure this will happen again. And in fact, there are signs that in Ethiopia, a similar situation is already developing. The 15,000 content moderators are window dressing because the algorithm will always be faster than humans. In fact, I was talking to somebody online who said, we were talking about ad reviews on Facebook, and he said, yeah, we're just going to run the ad. By the time they reject it, it has already been viewed. It's the same principle here. And it's also severely abusive of the content moderators. So there are reports that they used to have only 9 minutes a day of supervised personal breaks. And they make maybe $28,000, $30,000 per year, but there aren't even firm employees. This is all outsourced. Horseman number 3, alternative fact. So George Soros at Davos in 2018 gave an interesting speech. And he said, the internet monopolies have neither the will nor the inclination to protect society against the consequences of their actions. That turns them into a menace. And it falls to the regulatory authorities to protect society against them. I would argue this is not so surprising and wasn't so surprising in 2018. I must also note that George Soros is an extremely astute reader of politics and trends. I find his essays, which he publishes infrequently, very, very insightful. But it triggered Facebook, and so the company astroturfed back. It hired a right-wing marketing firm called Definers, which placed news, quote-unquote, articles on right-wing websites claiming that Soros is behind anti-Facebook efforts. Okay, well, let's look at Facebook's community standards that apply to us, the users. They are very much concerned that content is authentic because they want a better environment for sharing, and we don't want people to misrepresent anything. Well, by its own community standards, Facebook would be off Facebook by now, because outside coordination results typically in account termination. Former VP Elliot Schrage took responsibility for hiring Definers, but it looks very much like he took the fall for somebody else, and it's unclear what really transpired to this day. This is pretty distasteful, especially that Zuckerberg and Sandberg, who are both Jews, contribute to this right-wing paranoia about Soros, a Hungarian Jew. The worst part is all this has happened before. So one evening I was still at work at Facebook and I was working on my own ads, and I was curious how Facebook defines an ad impression. And I looked it up on the internal wiki. Here's what I found. Facebook uses a specific definition for an external impression. the number of times a unit was on screen. This is technically defined as 1 by 1 pixel of post or piece of content in a user's viewport for more than 0 seconds. And then in parentheses, we don't reveal this definition externally. So let's take this apart a bit. This is a very misleading notion of impression. A pixel? Yeah. There is no technical necessity for this. And it is very much self-enriching. The worst part is an astonishing display of shamelessness. So, because every employee of the firm has access to the wiki, every employee could view this document. At the same time, every employee was expected to keep the secret, namely that Facebook was defrauding its paying customers from day one. Somehow, Facebook kept the secret until September 2019. It has since published this odious definition of an impression. I fear I was a bit too loud complaining about it. But I talked to somebody who worked for Facebook's biggest competitor in their advertising team. And that person noted that all they could observe, what their own customers told them about numbers they saw on Facebook, it never made any sense unless you accounted for something like this definition. So when I told that person what the definition was, they said, we long suspected that. So all of this has happened before, and all of this, unfortunately, will happen again. Let's watch a little clip from a congressional hearing in October 2019.
So I don't remember everything that was in the question.
That's all right. I'll move on. Can you explain why you've named the Daily Caller, a publication well documented with ties to white supremacists, as an official fact checker for Facebook?
Congresswoman, sure. We actually don't appoint the independent fact checkers. They go through an independent organization called the Independent Fact Checking Network that has a rigorous standard for who they allow to serve as a fact checker.
So you would say that white supremacist tied publications meet a rigorous standard for fact checking?
This summer, Mr. Kaplan pushed to partner with right-wing news site The Daily Caller's fact-checking division after conservatives accused Facebook of working only with mainstream publishers, people familiar with the discussion set. The quote continues, Mr. Kaplan argued that The Daily Caller was accredited by the Poynter Institute. The contentious discussion involved Mr. Zuckerberg, who appeared to side with Mr. Kaplan, and Chief Operating Officer Sheryl Sandberg. That's what the Wall Street Journal said on the 23rd of December 2018. So Mr. Zuckerberg was clearly lying by omission when asked a direct question in Congress. Horseman number 4, daycare for engineers. So Facebook's pre-COVID culture was very interesting because Facebook has an amazing video conferencing setup. There's lots of small rooms in every single office. They have lots of comfy chairs. The video gear actually works seamlessly, reliably, which is almost a miracle. And yet the firm was very, very insistent that people have to come to work, even though teams were usually spread out. I was in the New York engineering office. I worked with people in Seattle. I worked with people in Menlo Park. I worked with people in Boston. I didn't work that much with people in New York, yet working from home was frowned upon. And the reason is that the firm is run as a cult, as a social impact cult. Much of the internal culture is designed to overwhelm, to make beholden, to undermine independence and critical thinking. I think it is no coincidence that this summer, after several months of lockdown and not being able to come to offices, employees at Facebook seemed to push back at a stronger rate than ever before. But still, Facebook loves to smother them with perks. There's the signing bonus, there's the high salaries, there are weekday meals, breakfast, lunch, dinner. There are snacks, T-shirts and hoodies, the pervasive swag. There's dry cleaning, though I don't really understand why Facebook employees would need dry cleaning. There are employee group outings, and the firm pays for them. And then there are the occasional fancy drinks and meals at inn spots, and so on. Facebook also tries to keep them comfy yet busy. So the offices look like some hipster vision of a welcoming frat house. Yet performance reviews happen every 6 months, which is totally insane, way too frequent. They keep managers busy for 2 or so weeks, and, well, nothing much happens during those 2.5 weeks. To give you a better feel, I'm going to share some impressions, all pictures I took over the 9 months. So you see a conference room, the pervasive vending machine. You just use your employee ID if you need some gadget. There's this great agitprop art. I mean, great graphic artists. The middle room doesn't exist anymore. This was actually the lobby of a former Boston office. Baby belts to your heart's content. Never eaten so many baby belts in my life before. Great art installations. Harry Potter themed room names. I do not want to know what happens in Avada Kedavra. But alas, leaving was very expensive because boom. However, not all was bad, because the impact of Facebook, the social impact, is real. I found my own voice as a writer on Facebook at the worst phase in my life. And so I know from firsthand experience, Facebook can be amazingly compelling. The New York City engineering office has the best job perk ever. So they have a gelato bar, 12 different flavors of gelato made fresh every week. I think I stayed 3 months longer than I would have without this perk. And finally, I've never worked with so many emotionally available straight men before. It was really noticeable how friendly and how human and how interactive straight men were at Facebook. And I'm highlighting this because Facebook actually, I know that Facebook interviews for that, it selects for that, and it's highly successful, and this was deeply impressive.
بين
3 3
بين
3
بين
3
3.
The heavenly warrior defeats the beast, or Facebook. 2 aspects of leverage in forcing Facebook to change. First of all, this is directed at all of you who are software engineers or designers. Facebook requires software engineers and designers. Why would you want to work for a firm that brings about genocide repeatedly when there are so many pressing problems on a global scale? This is New York City in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. Climate change is real. Climate change is catastrophic if we don't change things. Here you can see how downtown Manhattan was without electricity after Sandy. We're talking about novel diseases. This is the gazebo of the AIDS Memorial in Manhattan. And you're looking through it at night in April, and in the background you can see one of the refrigerated trucks full of COVID dead. On a Friday night, this is Manhattan at the end of April, empty. This is Times Square during the apocalypse. Or if you want to work on social justice, the country is being torn apart because police keep shooting black and brown people. It happened that the George Floyd protests started right outside my apartment building. This is the police presence. The best armed police were standing outside the Apple store next to my home. And for good measure, Apple decided to dress up the store as a penitentiary for the election. So there's more than enough good things to work on. Pour the creativity of technology and Silicon Valley into that. Why would you want to work for Facebook? The second angle is that Facebook is not yet a sovereign. It is bound by laws and regulations. Remember the Rose and Milton Friedman seal of good business keeping? I really believe in that because corporate responsibility is a sham. And we have the perfect experiment to determine that. Because last year, up to 200 CEOs pledged to the Business Roundtable to do better, to be more responsible. And then COVID-19 hit, and that provided the perfect test. Those 200 corporations paid out 20% more to shareholders than other corporations. They were 20% more likely to lay off employees. They were less likely to offer discounts to customers or to donate to charity. The thing is, this isn't even surprising. Behavioral psychologists call this moral self-licensing. When I think I'm good already, then I have more license to misbehave. One of the most egregious examples of this is Mark Benioff, a snake oil salesman. So Salesforce on the 25th of March of this year committed to not doing significant layoffs over the next 90 days. And Mr. Benioff used the term ohana, which is Hawaiian for extended family. And he took, this is like a very good example of cultural appropriation gone awry, because he takes a term that is truly meaningful in Hawaiian culture, stripped it of all connotations and used it in a business tweet. Well, it turns out Salesforce actually stuck with that. But then came August 25. Salesforce announced a record quarter. Revenue was up 29% year over year. It was one of the best quarters in the firm's 21-year-old history. And the same day, the firm laid off 1,000 employees. So, how do we counter this freedom to be asocial? The amazing thing is that Rose and Milton Friedman actually worked on that. And for well over a decade, they were arguing for negative income tax. It's essentially universal basic income, just like Martin Luther King Jr. did. But when it comes to social networks, well, more generally, only vigorous action by sovereigns works. There has to be a counterweight to the freedom of business, and that is regulations and laws. When it comes to social networks, there's three things sovereigns should do. First of all, they shouldn't let Facebook into their country unless these three rules or laws are met. And those are that it needs to require a local business presence with engineers. If Facebook isn't in a country and you let them into your country, you can say goodbye to your democracy. Don't do that. The country should require employees to review content. Engineers need to be forced to bear the brunt of the negatives of what they create. And outsourcing should be outlawed here. And finally, firms like Facebook need to be held financially liable for real-world harm. So, in conclusion, Facebook makes communication more frictionless. It manipulates us for financial gain. It has no discernible ethics. It practices techno-imperialism with genocidal consequences. Socially responsible social networking requires a local business presence. It requires that all employees review content. and it requires that the firms are liable for harm. Finally, we're all called upon to restore the Rohingyas' livelihood. This is imperative. Finally, I want to thank my parents, Rosa and Otto, for raising me to cherish personal integrity and for enabling an education that forms the basis of this dissent. Thank you.